Welcome to John Redmann, Power of Attorney, the show that aims to empower you through knowledge of the law. I'm attorney John Redmann.
And hello everyone, I'm Shauna Sanford. Welcome to the show. Well, whether you're moving in or out of an apartment or leasing a home, there are things everyone needs to know about their legal rights as a tenant and also the rights of landlords. The State Attorney General's office receives questions and complaints around this issue daily. In fact, this affects so many people that we're going to be talking about the landlord-tenant relationship today and in the week to follow.
You might be surprised to learn that Louisiana has some of the most landlord-friendly laws in the country, but problems still exist. And if you're a renter, what help is available if you're living in unsafe conditions, facing eviction, or just trying to get your security deposit back? Attorneys Amanda Golob and Laura Tuggle with Southeast Louisiana Legal Services will join us shortly to deal with those issues and more.
And there certainly are a lot of issues to deal with, but before we get to Amanda and Laura, John, you've talked about this. I know you're very passionate about it, but you feel like oftentimes the deck really is stacked against the tenant when it comes to these disputes. Why is that?
Well, let me say this. The deck is stacked in the sense that oftentimes the landlords, they're the ones who write the contract, that lease agreement that the tenant, the person who rents the apartment, has to sign. A lot of times he who writes the contract sets all the rules.
Right. And
the contract can have very onerous or very hard or difficult terms that are good for the landlord, bad for the tenant. The landlord can evict tenants at times based on the terms in that contract the landlord provides that make it easy for the landlord to get rid of the tenant if the landlord doesn't want the tenant there, if the landlord wants to maybe rent it out during Mardi Gras when there's people want to pay more.
Right.
So there's all kinds of things like that. On the other hand, the tenants do have rights. But we'll talk about that in this show, and we'll talk about it more in the second show.
Okay, all right. Well, coming up next, attorneys Amanda Golob and Laura Tuggle will talk landlord-tenant issues and rights. So stay tuned. We'll be right back. Hello everyone, welcome back to the show. Well, if you're in the middle of a dispute with your landlord and nothing is working out, you don't know where to turn next, or you can't afford an attorney to work with you, help is definitely on the way. We're excited to welcome our guests today who are experts in this area, and they're going to provide us with some much needed advice on rights and responsibilities of tenants and landlords.
Laura Tuggle and Amanda Golob work for the Southeast Louisiana Legal Services, providing help to tenants in their disputes with landlords. It's a pleasure to have you both on the show. Thanks very much for being here.
Thanks for having us.
This is such a big issue, and we have to say that we had your boss on not very long ago. So help us to learn a little bit more about Southeast Louisiana Legal Services. Who are you? Where are you? Who do you serve?
We are a nonprofit civil legal services law firm. We've been around since like 1968 in war on poverty. And we've been, our old name in the New Orleans area was New Orleans Legal Assistance Corporation, but we merged a number of years ago with our North Shore office, and we're now Southeast Louisiana Legal Services. We serve 22 parishes, and we have 6 physical locations, and it is exclusively on a variety of civil matters to low-income folks, and we have some guidelines that help us determine what that is.
So many people who need your services can actually have your help for free, provided they meet the income requirements or the lack of income requirements.
And Amanda, to be very clear, you only take civil cases. You don't do criminal cases, right?
We do not do criminal cases at all, only civil cases.
Yeah, and you handle a lot of landlord-tenant disputes. Is that right?
That's correct. We are the housing unit, and so they've actually created a unit because there are so many disputes that's just primarily what we focus on.
Yeah, well, I know if you go to the AG's website, they say they take questions and concerns about landlord-tenant disputes on a daily basis. Is that the same for you all?
We probably see anywhere between 5 to 10 clients a day. Folks just walk in the doors, particularly at our New Orleans office. You can also call 529-1000.
That's easy to remember.
Yes. Extension 223 is the housing law unit. You can also visit our website at www.slls.org.
Okay. Yeah, we'll get that up on the website. In fact, we have a an image of the Law Help
Okay.
website that it's very user-friendly. You don't have to be a law nerd or a techno nerd to be able to go through your website and get help. There it is on your screen right there. This is a place you can go and get a lot of helpful, useful information if you have legal issues. But we're going to talk about it today and hopefully answer a lot of those questions right here,
Okay.
right now.
Great.
Yeah, yeah. We were talking earlier, and you said a lot of these cases, they tend to be emergency cases. Is that right? Explain that a little bit.
Well, when the clients, by the time they come to see us, it's usually because what we call mad day has come, where you have had a problem that may have been bubbling up to the surface for sometimes weeks, sometimes months, and then it becomes an issue where someone has served you with an eviction notice, typically your landlord or the property manager, or you may just have some other issue where it absolutely has to be dealt with. There's a gas leak, or there's the landlord has come and illegally changed the locks, and so almost everything that comes in our door is something that we have to deal with almost immediately.
And you call it Mad Day because the landlord got mad at you, or you got mad at the landlord, and maybe you reported a code violation or something,
That is
and that
correct.
prompted the landlord to say, "That's it, I'm going to
Hit the road,
evict you,"
Jack.
whether or
Right.
not they had a proper authority to do that or not.
That is correct.
Okay.
So let's start at the beginning with the lease. A lot of issues come up with the lease, and I know that you all are big advocates of people reading that lease, but that's something that, a lot of times, we were talking earlier, you're so excited to finally get this place. You look at it, but you don't really read what's in that lease, and it's very important to do that, right, Amanda?
Absolutely, and I mean a lot of it is complicated legal language, which sometimes even for us takes a minute for us to really figure out what it's saying. What we've noticed, especially in Orleans Parish, is we see about 5 very common leases, and a lot of landlords either pull it off the internet. I know Home Depot, for example, sells a lease, and they might not read it all the way through. And it's important for both the landlord and the tenant to know what's in that lease, because that lease could add additional protections for the tenant or the landlord, or it could actually take some away. And so, we were
Read it carefully. Read that lease
Yes.
carefully, and as long as you read it carefully, and maybe if it's very confusing, if you have the opportunity, get a friend maybe who has some good book learning, somebody who's maybe got a good college degree, and they can help you read it. And they can, if you read that and you go, well, golly, this seems very unfair, you might want to look for another apartment, because
Right.
you don't want to, sign a lease that makes it completely unfair if you're a few days late, or sometimes these leases have ridiculous provisions in there that says if something breaks that's not your fault, the landlord says you got to fix it. Well, that's ridiculous, and that's not consistent with the law. Now, you might not know that,
Yeah.
but if it smells bad, then you can use your common sense and say, well, that's not the way it's worked on all the other leases I've signed. And you could ask the landlord to just scratch that out, remove it from the lease, or you're going to go live somewhere else.
And you both need to initial it.
Absolutely. You can't just scratch it out and say, well, I didn't agree with it, so I scratched it out all on my own. That's a very good point.
Because one person can't change the lease, right?
That is correct.
Yeah.
That is correct.
Yeah.
And in terms of a few other tenant consumer tips before you think about renting an apartment or a home, you really want to, just like if you were buying a home, you really want to kind of scope out the neighborhood, and in the daytime and the nighttime, because things can be different depending when you're there.
Be very different.
We've had some clients that have, taken the initiative of going and talking to neighbors. I wouldn't really advocate that, because, you don't necessarily want to do that right away. But there's a couple of other things you may want to consider, and one of them is whether or not you want to buy renter's insurance. Typically, if something happens, disasters, it's hurricane season.
Right.
If something happens with flood or wind, your personal possessions are not going to be covered by the landlord's policy, so that is something you may want to think about.
And that's a very good point. The same thing if there's a fire in the building. Your personal possessions are not going to be covered unless you have insurance that covers your personal possessions. The owner of the building, the landlord, they typically have insurance that protects the structure and will pay to rebuild the structure if there's a storm, if there's a fire, if there's a flood.
Right.
But that's the owner's structure. If you have your personal possessions in there, if they're stolen, if they are lost due to fire, flood, you're going to want to have renter's insurance for that.
And it's pretty cheap.
It is.
You know, I haven't checked on it recently, but sometimes you can get it as cheaply as, you know, less than $100 a year. It really just depends. I haven't looked at it in a while, but it's pretty affordable.
Right, and very, very important. Something for all renters out there to look into. But you all deal a lot with issues concerning subsidized housing, and those leases can be very different than leases with private owners because of the federal guidelines. Is that right?
That's correct. There are certain federal guidelines that would trump any sort of state law that would conflict with it, which means if there's a state law that says you don't need to have a notice, but the federal law says a notice is required, then the federal law is what would ultimately rule. And what is most important, we find, with subsidized housing is that they have an inspection process. Before you can even move into or have a Section 8 contract, they have to have an inspector come out and go through and make sure it meets their minimal housing standards.
These are requirements on the landlord, who hopes to get some federal dollars to make that housing more affordable to those who qualify for the subsidized housing, right? I want to take a moment too, and just for purposes of defining what we're going to cover in this episode versus the next episode, we want to get to the rights of tenant and landlord with regard to evictions and with regard to rent deposits. So maybe we can talk about that and get you to define generally what are the rights of each landlord and tenant when it comes to the eviction process and with respect to somebody getting their deposits back. Maybe start with evictions. You want to start, Amanda?
Absolutely. So the first step in any sort of eviction would be a notice that the tenant would receive. And under Louisiana law, the landlord has to give a 5-day notice, a minimal 5-day notice to vacate, letting the tenant know why they want them out. And it could just be the owner wants the property back. It doesn't have to. Even
if there's a lease that says it's a 6-month or a 1-year lease?
If there is a lease term, then the owner can't just have no cause and remove somebody during the lease term. But if the tenant hasn't paid rent, if there's any sort of dispute between the landlord-tenant, if there's a pet there that's not supposed to be there, the landlord can bring the action. And so the first step would be a written notice. Okay. This written notice doesn't have to come from the constable's office. It doesn't have to come from an attorney. It could be written on the back of a napkin. And
they put it tack it on your door, or how do they give you the notice?
They can tack it on your door, they can mail it to you, they can hand it to you. The tacking is okay, and a lot of people think, oh, I just got this notice on my door, it's not on an official document paper.
Doesn't matter.
It still counts as the notice.
The fact of the matter is, it has to be a written notice. Your landlord can't just say, I want you out of here. He or she will post some sort of notice.
That's correct.
Okay, and if you get that written notice,
then
if
what?
you're the tenant, what are your rights? What can you do?
That notice gives you a period to let you know that the landlord wants you out. We recommend to always try to talk to your landlord and try to work it out. If you owe them money, try to work out a payment plan. If it's an issue with a pet, just try to talk it over, see if there's any way to repair that landlord-tenant relationship. Because during that 5 days, they can't actually come in and remove your items or change the locks or do anything like that. After that 5-day period is up, the landlord can then file in court for an eviction, which is called a rule of possession.
Yeah. Well,
and if I might add, just reiterating, when you get that notice, that's a really good time for you to read that lease again.
Right.
Because you will frequently find out, often even to the landlord's surprise, that if they obtained a lease from Home Depot or from MrLandlord.com or some website like that, there may be protections in there that are modeled off of another state, which may require things like a right to cure if it's a lease violation, or it may require a cease and desist notice. Or the holy grail for us is if we happen to see a mediation or arbitration clause. And so when you get that notice, that is really the time that if you do have a written lease, check it out, or have a lawyer check it out.
Okay, and we're going to have to ask you to hold it right there because we have to take a quick break. Coming up next, we take your questions about landlord-tenant disputes, and we're going to get more into deposits and security deposits. So stay tuned. We'll be right back.
That's great.